Greetings, my friends, new and old. My name is Sage, and I'm here to guide you through the history and lore behind the wizarding world. Feel free to get cozy and relax, or even fade into deep slumber as we dive into this video's theme: Lost Wizarding Schools. Tonight we're exploring wizarding schools that no longer exist, institutions that once shaped young witches and wizards before fading into silence, ruin, or deliberate erasure, told in a soft-spoken, sleep-friendly narration steeped in the quiet corners of magical history. Long before the towers of Hogwarts rose above the Scottish Highlands, before its moving staircases settled into routine and its houses became cultural pillars, magical education was far more uncertain and far more fragile. The teaching of magic began not with castles or curricula, but with necessity. Young witches and wizards manifested power whether guidance existed or not, and without instruction, that power often turned destructive. Communities learned quickly that magic left untaught was as dangerous as magic wielded with malice. In these earliest periods of wizarding history, education took place wherever secrecy and survival allowed it. Some instruction happened within family bloodlines, passed from parent to child in quiet kitchens or remote farmsteads. Other teachings occurred in hidden enclaves, where small groups of magical families banded together for mutual protection and shared learning. These gatherings were often informal at first, but over time, many grew into structured schools, complete with rules, rituals, and philosophies of magic that reflected the fears and hopes of their regions. Unlike modern institutions, early magical schools rarely sought permanence. Survival was the priority, not legacy. Many were designed to be abandoned at a moment's notice, protected by enchantments that could be dismantled quickly if discovery seemed imminent. Buildings were often temporary or disguised, woven into ruins, monasteries, or natural formations. The idea of a school lasting centuries would have seemed implausible to witches and wizards who lived under constant threat of exposure or persecution. Persecution shaped everything about early magical education. In times when Muggles feared magic openly, schools were forced deeper underground, both literally and metaphorically. Locations were chosen not for comfort, but for isolation. Mountains, dense forests, deserts, and remote islands became common settings for instruction. While this isolation protected students from outside threats, it also left schools vulnerable to collapse if supplies failed, leadership faltered, or internal conflict arose. Another challenge faced by these early schools was the unpredictable nature of magic itself. Spellcraft was far less standardized than it is today. Without shared texts or agreed upon theory, instructors relied heavily on experimentation. While this led to innovation, it also produced instability. Magical accidents could permanently warp a location, rendering it unsafe for continued use. Some schools were abandoned after a single catastrophic failure, their names surviving only in fragmented references or distorted legend. Early wizarding schools were also deeply shaped by regional belief systems. Magic was not yet divided cleanly into disciplines like charms, transfiguration, or potions. Instead, it flowed along cultural lines. In some regions, magic was viewed as a spiritual force, requiring moral purification and ritual discipline. In others, it was treated as a natural phenomenon to be harnessed and refined. These differing philosophies often clashed when students or instructors moved between schools, sometimes with disastrous consequences. Leadership played an outsized role in whether a school endured or vanished. Many early institutions were founded by singularly powerful witches or wizards whose personal mastery allowed a school to flourish. Yet when those founders died, disappeared, or lost control, their schools often collapsed. Few had succession plans or distributed authority. A school built around one mind was rarely resilient once that mind was gone. Despite these challenges, many early schools succeeded for a time. They produced skilled healers, formidable defenders, and innovative theorists. Some even rivaled later institutions in scope and influence. However, success often attracted attention, and attention was dangerous. As schools grew, secrecy became harder to maintain. Students travelled, stories spread, and eventually the outside world took notice. Conflict between magical communities also contributed to the disappearance of early schools. Disagreements over magical ethics, blood status, or political allegiance sometimes escalated into open warfare. Unlike later conflicts regulated by ministries, these wars were chaotic and brutal. Schools were prime targets, both symbolically and strategically. Destroying an enemy's centre of education meant crippling their future. It is important to understand that many vanished schools did not fail because they were inferior. They failed because they existed in a world that had not yet learned how to protect them. The survival of institutions like Hogwarts was not inevitable. It was the result of rare cooperation, careful balance, and historical timing that most early schools simply did not have. As we move forward through wizarding history, we will encounter the echoes of these lost places again and again. Their influence lingers in spells whose origins are forgotten, in magical practices that seem oddly regional, and in philosophies that survive only as fragments. These schools may no longer exist, but they shaped the foundations upon which modern magical education stands. Long before Hogwarts became synonymous with magical education, before its towers settled into legend and routine, the teaching of magic was far more fragmented, fragile, and personal. In the earliest days of wizarding civilization, knowledge passed not through grand halls, but through whispered instruction, family tutelage, secluded sanctuaries, and wandering masters who carried their spells as much in memory as in ink. Magic, by its nature, demanded secrecy, and secrecy shaped how it was taught. Many early schools were born not of ambition, but of necessity, founded in response to persecution, isolation, or the unpredictable dangers of uncontrolled magical growth. These early institutions often existed on the edges of society, hidden deep in forests, carved into mountainsides, or woven into settlements that appeared unremarkable to non-magical eyes. Some lasted generations, becoming pillars of regional wizarding culture. Others survived only a handful of decades before war, fear, or magical catastrophe erased them entirely. Unlike Hogwarts, which benefited from four founders of rare balance and foresight, many of these schools were sustained by singular visions, powerful yet unstable. And when those visions failed, the schools collapsed with them. In ancient magical communities, education was rarely standardized. Spellcraft varied wildly from region to region, shaped by local creatures, climates, and belief systems. A healing charm taught in the Mediterranean bore little resemblance to one practiced in the frozen north. Defensive magic in regions plagued by magical beasts evolved differently than spells developed in lands threatened by hostile wizarding factions. These differences gave rise to schools that were deeply specialized, sometimes brilliant, sometimes dangerously narrow. As magical populations grew, so too did the need for structured instruction. This was not merely about teaching spells, but about controlling magic before it controlled the caster. accidental magic, left untrained, could devastate communities. Early schools emerged as a solution, offering containment, discipline, and shared knowledge. Yet they also concentrated power, and power, when unchecked, has always drawn conflict. Some of the earliest known proto-schools existed in ancient Greece, where philosophers and magic users blurred into one another. These were not schools in the modern sense, but academies where magical theory intertwined with mathematics, astronomy, and metaphysics. Spellwork was treated as a natural extension of understanding reality itself. Records from later wizarding historians reference these institutions indirectly, preserved through fragments of wand movements, potion formulations, and enchantments whose origins predate recorded European wizarding history. Many of these Greek magical academies vanished alongside their mundane counterparts, victims of shifting empires and cultural upheaval. As magical practice became increasingly associated with danger and heresy, instruction retreated underground. Some schools dissolved peacefully, their teachings absorbed into family lineages. Others were destroyed outright when their practices were deemed too volatile or too closely aligned with what later generations would label dark magic. In the Roman world, magic schools often aligned with engineering and military infrastructure. Enchantment was practical, applied to roads, fortifications, and communication. When the Roman magical network collapsed, so too did the schools that sustained it. Without centralized authority, many institutions fractured, their instructors scattering or disappearing. What knowledge survived did so in pieces, hidden within later spellcraft that bore no record of its origin. Northern Europe developed its own traditions, deeply tied to nature and elemental forces. Schools in these regions often functioned seasonally, gathering students during safer months and dispersing when winters grew too harsh. These schools emphasized wandless magic, runic systems, and communion with magical creatures. Their disappearance was gradual, accelerated by climate shifts, population movement, and later the rise of centralized schools like Hogwarts that offered year-round instruction and greater protection. By the early medieval period, Europe housed dozens of magical schools, many now lost to time. Some rivaled Hogwarts in size and influence, others were intimate, teaching no more than a dozen students at once. Wars between wizarding factions devastated several of these institutions. Unlike Muggle wars, magical conflict could leave land permanently altered, cursed or uninhabitable. Entire campuses were abandoned when lingering enchantments rendered them unsafe for generations. The founding of Hogwarts marked a turning point. Its emphasis on balance, inclusivity, and defensive secrecy allowed it to endure where others failed. Yet its success also reshaped the educational landscape. As Hogwarts drew students from wider regions, smaller schools struggled to survive. Some closed voluntarily, merging their traditions into the Hogwarts curriculum. Others resisted, clinging to older philosophies that ultimately isolated them. Beyond Europe, wizarding education followed very different paths. In the Middle East and Central Asia, ancient schools focused heavily on alchemy and astronomy. These institutions viewed magic as a dialogue with the cosmos, teaching students to read the stars as carefully as spellbooks. Many were destroyed during periods of religious upheaval, when magic became entangled with accusations of blasphemy. Survivors often dismantled their schools themselves, dispersing knowledge to protect it from eradication. In parts of Africa and Asia, magical education was deeply oral, passed through stories, rituals, and lived experience, rather than written curricula. Schools existed as moving communities rather than fixed structures. Their disappearance is harder to trace, not because they were insignificant, but because their histories were never recorded in ways later historians could easily preserve. When communities were displaced, the schools vanished with them. Some schools were not lost accidentally, but deliberately destroyed. Wizarding authorities, fearing dangerous experimentation, sanctioned the closure of institutions that push magic too far. In documented cases, entire schools were sealed, their locations erased from maps, their names struck from records. These were places where ethics failed to keep pace with innovation, where students were taught magic without restraint or consequence. Others collapsed from within. Leadership corrupted by ideology or ambition turned schools into breeding grounds for extremism. Students rebelled, accidents multiplied, and eventually the magic itself became unstable. Buildings warped, wards failed, and what once sheltered learning became a threat to life. The students of these vanished schools faced uncertain futures, some integrated into surviving institutions, struggling to adapt to unfamiliar magical philosophies. Others returned to family instruction, carrying fragments of lost traditions that faded within a generation. Entire branches of spellcraft disappeared, not because they were weak, but because no one remained to teach them. Even now, remnants persist. Enchanted ruins hidden by concealment charms, spells whose origins no text can trace, magical artifacts designed as teaching tools, long divorced from their original purpose. These echoes remind us that wizarding history is incomplete by design, shaped as much by loss as by survival. Modern wizarding society knows little of these schools, not because they were unimportant, but because history favours continuity. Surviving institutions dominate narratives, while vanished ones fade into footnotes, if they're mentioned at all. Memory erodes, records decay, and sometimes forgetting is intentional. When schools vanish, more than buildings are lost. Entire ways of understanding magic disappear. Ethical frameworks, cultural perspectives, and alternative approaches to power fade quietly, leaving gaps that no single institution can fill. The wizarding world we know is shaped as much by what it has forgotten as by what it remembers. And so, as we linger among the ghosts of these lost schools, we are reminded that education itself is one of the most powerful forms of magic, fragile, enduring, and always at risk of being lost. If you enjoyed exploring these forgotten corners of wizarding history, consider liking the video and subscribing to continue uncovering the lore that time almost erased. In the centuries before Hogwarts was founded, the Mediterranean basin was one of the most intellectually dense regions in the magical world, and it was here that some of the earliest recognizable schools of magic emerged. These were not schools in the modern sense, with fixed curricula and age-based cohorts, but rather academies of thought where magic was studied as an extension of philosophy, mathematics, and natural law. To study magic in these places was to study the structure of reality itself. Ancient Greek magical academies often existed alongside their Muggle philosophical counterparts, hidden in plain sight through enchantments that bent perception rather than erased presence. To non-magical scholars, these places appeared as ordinary schools of rhetoric or astronomy. To witches and wizards, however, they were sites of profound experimentation, where spellcraft was theorized long before it was formalized. Wand movements were derived from geometric principles, and incantations were shaped by linguistic precision rather than inherited tradition. Instruction in these academies emphasized understanding over obedience. Students were taught not merely how to cast spells, but why magic behaved as it did. This approach produced extraordinarily capable practitioners, but it also carried significant risk. Without rigid ethical boundaries, students were encouraged to test limits, sometimes catastrophically. Several academies were abandoned after experimental magic destabilized their surroundings, creating zones where enchantments lingered uncontrollably. Roman magical schools, by contrast, were intensely practical. Magic was treated as infrastructure, a tool to support empire rather than question it. These schools trained enchanters who reinforced roads, protected supply lines, and enhanced communication across vast distances. The collapse of Roman authority fractured these institutions almost overnight. Without centralized coordination, the schools dissolved. Their instructors either absorbed into local communities or lost to history. Celtic and Druidic schools flourished further north, rooted in oral tradition and deep environmental attunement. These schools rarely used permanent structures. Instruction occurred in groves, stone circles, and shifting seasonal camps. Students learned wandless magic, runic systems, and creature-based symbiosis. Their disappearance was gradual, not violent, as populations migrated and traditions fragmented. What survived did so in fragments, absorbed into later spellcraft without attribution. As Christianity spread across Europe, many magical academies were forced underground or dismantled entirely. Some schools attempted coexistence, disguising magical instruction as monastic scholarship. Others rejected concealment and were destroyed. This period accounts for the disappearance of dozens of institutions whose names survive only in distorted references within later wizarding texts. These early schools were deeply influential, despite their disappearance. Potion theory, astronomical magic, and early transfiguration principles all trace their roots to these proto-academies. Yet because their knowledge was transmitted unevenly, much was lost or misinterpreted. Later institutions inherited techniques without understanding their original context. The founding of Hogwarts did not erase these traditions, but it did overshadow them. Hogwarts offered stability, protection, and legitimacy that earlier schools could not sustain. As students gravitated toward its walls, older academies struggled to justify their existence. Some closed willingly, donating texts and artifacts. Others resisted and faded into obscurity. What remains of these ancient schools today is not found in buildings, but in magic itself, in spells that feel older than their recorded names, in wand movements that seem strangely mathematical or ritualistic. These are the quiet fingerprints of institutions that once stood at the centre of magical thought, now reduced to echoes, embedded in everyday practice. As we continue, we move from these early philosophical academies into the era of formal European wizarding schools that rose, rivaled one another, and vanished in the long shadow cast by Hogwarts' survival. As Europe moved deeper into the medieval period, magical education began to take on a more recognisable institutional shape. Permanent schools emerged with defined leadership, dedicated student bodies, and increasingly formalised instruction. For a time, the continent supported several prominent wizarding schools simultaneously, each shaped by regional values, political realities, and distinct philosophies of magic. Some of these institutions rivaled Hogwarts in reputation and reach, yet none endured in quite the same way. Many of these schools arose in regions where magical populations were dense but geographically divided. Mountain passes, borderlands, and coastal territories became natural gathering points for wizarding communities seeking both isolation and access. Schools founded in these areas often specialised in defensive magic, survival spellcraft, and martial applications of enchantment. Their students were trained not just to practice magic, but to defend themselves against hostile forces, magical and otherwise. One such class of schools flourished in Central and Eastern Europe, where shifting borders and frequent conflict shaped magical priorities. These institutions emphasized discipline, loyalty, and strength, often blurring the line between education and militarization. While this produced formidable witches and wizards, it also fostered rigid hierarchies and ideological extremism. When leadership became corrupted or internal dissent erupted, schools fractured violently. Wizarding wars proved particularly devastating to educational centres. Unlike individual settlements, schools concentrated young, powerful magic users in one place, making them both strategic assets and irresistible targets. Some schools were destroyed outright during sieges that left no survivors capable of preserving their records. Others were cursed so thoroughly that rebuilding was impossible, their grounds permanently unstable, wards twisted into hostile remnants of their former purpose. Not all disappearances were dramatic. In some cases, schools declined quietly as students chose alternatives. The founding of Hogwarts introduced a new model of magical education that prioritized balance, broad instruction, and long-term stability. Its location, protected by formidable enchantments and distant from major population centres, offered a level of safety few other schools could match. Over time, Hogwarts drew students from regions that once sustained their own institutions. Some schools attempted to adapt, narrowing their focus or aligning themselves with Hogwarts indirectly. Others resisted, viewing Hogwarts as a homogenizing force that threatened regional magical identity. These schools often isolated themselves further, reducing enrollment until they could no longer sustain operations. When the last instructors died or retired, the schools simply ceased to function. Political pressure also played a role. As early ministries of magic began to form, regulation of magical education increased. Schools that refused oversight or adhered to controversial doctrines found themselves marginalized. In extreme cases, ministries intervened directly, shutting down institutions deemed dangerous or subversive. Records of these closures were often sealed, contributing to the illusion that such schools had never existed. Religious influence continued to complicate matters. In regions where magic was increasingly associated with heresy or witchcraft, schools struggled to remain hidden. Even with magical concealment, maintaining a large student population became risky. Some institutions preemptively disbanded, scattering their students among safer alternatives rather than risk exposure. Despite their disappearance, these European schools left lasting marks on magical practice. Certain dueling techniques, curse structures, and defensive enchantments trace their lineage to institutions long gone. These techniques survive because magic remembers even when history does not. Wizards continue to use spells perfected in schools whose names they have never heard. By the time Hogwarts had firmly established itself as the dominant magical school in the British Isles and beyond, the landscape of European wizarding education had already been irreversibly altered. What remained was a patchwork of surviving institutions and a vast unspoken graveyard of schools that had once stood at the heart of magical life, now reduced to silence. From here, the story of vanished schools expands beyond Europe, following the paths of magic into regions where education took very different forms and where loss was shaped not only by war and politics, but by culture, colonization, and the quiet erosion of tradition. Beyond Western Europe, wizarding education followed paths shaped by vastly different cultural, spiritual, and philosophical foundations. In Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, magical schools often existed at the intersection of scholarship and mysticism. These institutions treated magic not merely as a tool to be wielded, but as a force to be harmonized with cosmic order, time, and transformation. As a result, their methods and ultimately their vulnerabilities differed sharply from those of their Western counterparts. In Eastern Europe, several schools rose around traditions of alchemy and elemental balance. These institutions taught that magic was something to be refined internally before it could be expressed externally. Students spent years studying transmutation theory, potion refinement, and the symbolic language of magical change. Progress was slow and demanding, but graduates were renowned for their precision and restraint. Unfortunately, these same qualities made the schools ill-suited to survive periods of rapid political upheaval. As borders shifted and empires expanded, many of these schools found themselves caught between competing authorities. Magical neutrality was difficult to maintain when surrounding powers demanded allegiance or suppression. Some schools were forcibly absorbed into emerging magical bureaucracies. Their independent teachings diluted. Others were destroyed when their refusal to align was interpreted as threat or heresy. In the Middle East, wizarding schools often aligned themselves with centers of astronomical study. Magic was taught in relation to celestial movement, timekeeping, and prophecy. Instruction emphasized patience, observation, and long-term consequence. These schools produced remarkable seers and enchanters capable of working magic that unfolded over years rather than moments. Yet this long-view approach also left institutions vulnerable when sudden cultural or religious shifts reframed magic as forbidden. Periods of iconoclasm and reform proved devastating. Schools that had endured for centuries were dismantled in mere decades, their libraries burned or hidden away. In some cases, instructors chose to erase their own institutions, scattering texts and students rather than allow knowledge to be corrupted or weaponized. What survived did so in fragments, preserved by families or isolated enclaves rather than schools. Central Asian wizarding schools often embraced mobility. Located along trade routes, they functioned as travelling academies, moving with caravans and adapting to shifting political landscapes. This flexibility allowed them to survive longer than many fixed institutions, but it also made record-keeping difficult. When these schools finally disappeared, they left behind little physical evidence, contributing to their near-total absence from modern historical accounts. These Eastern schools also placed heavy emphasis on wandless magic. Tools were viewed as secondary to mastery of self. While this produced formidable practitioners, it complicated integration with later, wand-centric institutions. Students trained in these traditions often struggled to adapt elsewhere, reinforcing the isolation of their schools and accelerating their decline. Despite their disappearance, Eastern wizarding schools influenced global magic profoundly. Techniques of potion distillation, time-delayed enchantments, and non-verbal spellcasting all bear traces of these traditions. Yet without institutional continuity, their philosophies faded, leaving behind practices divorced from their original intent. The loss of these schools was not always sudden or violent. In many cases, it was the result of gradual erosion. Enrollment dwindled, masters passed away without successors. Cultural priorities shifted. Over generations, schools became memories, then myths, then nothing at all. As wizarding history moved into an increasingly globalized era, the disappearance of these institutions marked a turning point. Magic was becoming standardized, regulated, and centralized. What did not fit within that framework was quietly left behind. From here, the story widens further, turning toward regions where magical education was deeply communal, oral, and intertwined with identity itself, and where the loss of schools meant the loss of entire ways of seeing magic. In many parts of Africa, Asia, and Oceania, the concept of a magical school looked very different from the stone halls and fixed campuses familiar to European wizarding tradition. Education in these regions was often inseparable from community, ancestry, and land. Magic was not treated as a subject to be mastered in isolation, but as a living relationship between people, place, and history. As a result, when these schools vanished, they did so quietly, leaving behind far fewer traces than their Western counterparts. African wizarding schools that no longer exist were frequently organized around lineage and stewardship, rather than age or academic progression. Instruction was communal, with elders guiding younger witches and wizards through ritual practice, healing traditions, and environmental magic tied to specific regions. Knowledge was transmitted orally and experientially, making it resilient in some ways, but extremely vulnerable in others. When communities were displaced or fractured, the schools vanished with them. Some of these institutions functioned seasonally, gathering students during periods of agricultural rest or spiritual significance. Others were anchored to sacred sites whose magic was believed to be inseparable from the land itself. When those sites were disturbed, corrupted, or rendered inaccessible, instruction could not continue elsewhere. Unlike European schools, relocation was often impossible because the magic being taught could not be separated from its origin. In parts of Asia, vanished wizarding schools emphasized internal mastery and spiritual discipline. Magic was approached through meditation, breath control, and long-term cultivation of intent. Students trained for years before attempting even basic spell work. These schools produced exceptionally controlled magic users, but their slow, inward-facing methods struggled to survive periods of rapid social change. When populations shifted or outside pressures disrupted tradition, enrollment collapsed. Several Asian schools disappeared during eras of centralization, when magical authority was consolidated under imperial or ministerial control. Independent schools were viewed as destabilizing influences, and many were absorbed, regulated out of existence, or quietly dismantled. Their teachings survived only where families continued them privately, stripped of institutional identity. In Oceania, magical education was deeply intertwined with navigation, weather, and ancestral memory. Schools existed as networks rather than locations, with instruction occurring across islands and voyages. Magic was taught through song, story, and shared experience, making it extraordinarily difficult for outsiders to document. When colonial disruption fractured these networks, the schools ceased to function as coherent entities. Colonization had a profound and often irreversible impact on non-European magical schools. Displacement, secrecy pressures, and forced integration into foreign magical systems eroded traditions that had endured for centuries. Wand-based instruction replaced wandless practice. Written curricula supplanted oral teaching. In many cases, this transition was framed as progress, while the loss of indigenous schools went unacknowledged. The disappearance of these schools is one of the greatest blind spots in modern wizarding history. Their absence is often mistaken for absence of sophistication, when in reality it reflects a failure of documentation. What little is known comes from second-hand accounts, fragmented spell theory, and the lingering effectiveness of magic, whose origins are no longer remembered. Despite this loss, the influence of these schools persists. Healing magic, environmental enchantment, and non-verbal spellcasting owe much to traditions that once thrived in these regions. Modern practitioners benefit from techniques refined over generations, even as the institutions that developed them remain unnamed. The vanishing of these schools reminds us that history does not disappear evenly. Some losses are loud and recorded, others fade so completely that only their effects remain. As the wizarding world became more interconnected, these quiet erasures shaped what was remembered and what was allowed to be forgotten. From here, the story turns darker, examining schools that did not simply fade or collapse, but were actively destroyed, erased because the magic they taught was deemed too dangerous to survive. Not all wizarding schools vanish through neglect, migration, or the slow erosion of tradition. Some were erased deliberately, their destruction sanctioned or carried out by wizarding authorities who judged the knowledge being taught too dangerous to survive. These were schools that crossed lines their contemporaries either feared to approach or failed to recognise until it was too late. In many cases, these institutions began with legitimate aims. They sought to understand the deeper mechanics of magic, to explore boundaries that conventional schools avoided. Their founders often believed that ignorance, not power, was the true danger. Unfortunately, ambition frequently outpaced restraint. Experimental spellcraft, unstable enchantments, and ethically compromised research became commonplace, sometimes long before oversight bodies existed to intervene. As early ministries of magic formed, one of their first priorities was containment. Schools operating outside emerging regulatory frameworks were viewed as liabilities. Those associated with uncontrolled curses, soul magic, or large-scale manipulation of minds and environments drew particular scrutiny. Investigations were often secretive, their findings sealed to prevent panic or imitation. When closures occurred, they were rarely gentle. In some instances, auras dismantled campuses ward by ward, neutralizing enchantments and confiscating texts. Libraries were burned or locked away in restricted archives. Students were reassigned or, in more troubling cases, obliviated to prevent the spread of forbidden knowledge. Entire generations lost access to their own educational history overnight. There were also schools whose destruction was driven not by government, but by collective fear. When an institution's experiments resulted in visible catastrophe, surrounding communities demanded action. Magical fallout zones, cursed landscapes, and irreversible transformations left little room for debate. The schools responsible were often destroyed completely, their names intentionally excluded from official records. The ethical question of whether such erasure was justified remains unresolved. While some schools undeniably posed existential risks, others may have been shut down prematurely, victims of political expediency rather than true danger. The absence of transparent records makes it impossible to assess how much knowledge was lost unnecessarily. What is clear is that deliberate destruction created gaps that modern magic still grapples with. Certain branches of spellcraft simply end, their progression halted abruptly. Wizards encounter limitations they cannot explain, boundaries that feel arbitrary because the research that might have clarified them was erased. There is also the psychological cost. The message sent by these closures was unmistakable. Some knowledge is too dangerous to exist. While this caution has undoubtedly prevented catastrophe, it has also fostered stagnation and fear-driven conservatism within magical academia. In rare cases, fragments survived. Instructors who escaped carried teachings into exile. Students passed on diluted versions of what they learned. These remnants surface occasionally, misunderstood and stripped of context, their origins obscured by deliberate forgetting. The schools that were destroyed deliberately are among the hardest to reconstruct, not because they were insignificant, but because their erasure was thorough. Silence in these cases was policy. From here, we turn inward, examining schools that collapsed not because they were attacked from outside, but because they were undone by their own internal failures. While some wizarding schools were destroyed by external forces, others were undone slowly and painfully from within. These institutions did not fall to invasion or decree, but to internal rot, the gradual accumulation of unresolved conflict, corrupted leadership, and magical instability that no ward or enchantment could permanently contain. In many such cases, collapse began with ideology. Schools founded around singular philosophies often thrived initially, attracting students who shared a common vision of magic's purpose. Over time, however, these philosophies hardened into dogma. Dissent was discouraged. Alternative approaches were dismissed as weakness or betrayal. What began as focus became extremism, and education narrowed instead of deepening. Leadership failures accelerated this process. Charismatic founders who ruled unchallenged often left no mechanisms for accountability. As years passed, successors inherited authority without the wisdom or restraint of their predecessors. Favoritism, secrecy, and abuse of power became normalized. Students learned quickly that advancement depended less on merit than on alignment with prevailing ideology. Magic itself magnified these failures. Schools experimenting with advanced spellcraft often relied on layered enchantments to support their infrastructure. When those enchantments were maintained improperly or pushed beyond their limits, feedback loops emerged. Classrooms shifted unpredictably. Protective wards turned hostile. In extreme cases, the environment itself became sentient in fragmented, dangerous ways. Student unrest was another recurring factor. As conditions deteriorated, students rebelled, sometimes violently. Magical duels escalated into full-scale confrontations. In institutions without strong ethical grounding, these conflicts were settled through force rather than mediation. Casualties mounted, and trust between faculty and students eroded completely. Some schools attempted reform too late. Committees were formed, rules rewritten. But once magic had been destabilized at an institutional level, recovery was rare. Buildings warped under accumulated enchantment. Grounds became unsafe. Eventually, evacuation was the only option. There are records of schools abandoned overnight, students fleeing as containment wards failed. These places were sealed hastily, their locations concealed to prevent curious intrusion. Over time, memory of them faded, replaced by rumours of cursed ruins and forbidden zones. Unlike schools destroyed deliberately, these institutions left behind scattered evidence, incomplete records, personal journals, spells that abruptly stop evolving. Historians piece together their stories cautiously, aware that surviving accounts are often biased, written by those who escaped rather than those who suffered most. The tragedy of these collapses lies in their preventability. Many began with genuine educational intent. Their failures serve as reminders that magic amplifies human flaws as readily as human strengths. With these internal collapses accounted for, we now turn to those most affected by vanished schools, the students themselves and the generations shaped by interrupted education. When a wizarding school vanished, the loss did not end with collapsed walls or sealed libraries. The most immediate and enduring impact was felt by the students themselves. Young witches and wizards whose education was interrupted, redirected, or erased entirely. Their stories rarely appear in official histories, yet they carried the consequences of these disappearances for the rest of their lives. For many students, the sudden closure of a school meant displacement. Some were absorbed into surviving institutions, often far from home, where unfamiliar teaching methods and cultural expectations left them struggling to adapt. A student trained in wandless magic or ritual-based spellcraft might find themselves abruptly required to conform to wand-centric, standardized curricula. What they once understood intuitively was dismissed as unconventional or obsolete. Others were less fortunate. In regions where no alternative institutions existed, students returned to family instruction, relying on fragmented knowledge and inherited tradition. Education became uneven, dependent on lineage rather than aptitude. Entire cohorts of witches and wizards entered adulthood with gaps in their training, limiting their magical development and professional prospects. The psychological toll was significant. Schools provided more than instruction. They offered structure, community, and identity. When those anchors disappeared, students often experienced profound instability. Some abandoned formal magical practice altogether, choosing quieter lives rather than risk uncontrolled power. Others pursued dangerous self-teaching, filling gaps through experimentation that sometimes mirrored the very excesses that destroyed their schools. Displaced students also carried stigmas. Graduates of vanished or discredited institutions were viewed with suspicion. Employers questioned the legitimacy of their education. Ministries monitored them more closely, wary of residual influence from controversial teachings. In some cases, former students concealed their educational background entirely, allowing the memory of their schools to fade even faster. Generational effects followed. Parents who had experienced educational collapse were often hesitant to trust institutions with their own children. This skepticism slowed enrollment growth at surviving schools and encouraged private instruction, further decentralizing magical education. Over time, this contributed to uneven skill distribution across wizarding populations. Culturally, the disappearance of schools fractured shared magical identity. Without common educational experiences, regional differences deepened, spell pronunciation diverged, ethical norms shifted. What was considered responsible magic in one community seemed reckless in another. These divisions persist subtly even today. Some former students became carriers of lost knowledge. Techniques taught nowhere else survived in modified forms, passed quietly to apprentices or descendants. Without institutional support, these practices evolved unpredictably, sometimes losing their original intent. Historians occasionally encounter spells or rituals that resist classification, remnants of curricula that no longer exist. The loss of schools also affected innovation. Education fuels progress, and when training pipelines collapse, experimentation stagnates. Entire branches of magic plateaued for centuries because the institutions capable of nurturing advanced research were gone. Modern limitations often trace back not to lack of talent, but to historical interruption. As the wizarding world adjusted, it normalized absence. New generations grew up unaware that alternatives had ever existed. The vanished schools became curiosities, then myths, then nothing at all. Yet their influence endures quietly, woven into the lives of those shaped by loss rather than continuity. From here, we turn our attention to the physical and magical remnants that still linger, silent witnesses to institutions the world has forgotten. Although wizarding schools may vanish from maps and memory, they rarely disappear completely. Magic leaves residue, and places where generations of young witches and wizards lived, learned, and practiced spellcraft become saturated with intent, emotion, and layered enchantment. Long after instruction ceases, these sites persist as remnants, quiet and often dangerous witnesses to forgotten institutions. Some remnants take the form of ruins, hidden behind powerful concealment charms. To the untrained eye, they appear as ordinary stretches of wilderness or abandoned stone. To those sensitive to magic, however, these places feel heavy, charged with lingering spells that were never fully dismantled. Protective wards, once carefully maintained, degrade unpredictably, activating without warning or mutating into something hostile. Other remnants are less physical and more insidious. Enchanted classrooms collapse into pocket spaces that distort time or perception. Corridors loop endlessly. Doors open onto places that no longer exist. These phenomena are not deliberate defences, but the result of magical systems left running without guidance, slowly decaying into instability. Artifacts are another enduring legacy. Teaching tools designed to demonstrate advanced principles often outlast the schools that created them. Spell mirrors, enchanted manuscripts, and experimental apparatus circulate through private collections or black markets, stripped of context. Without understanding their intended use, modern practitioners risk catastrophic misuse. Magical creatures bound to abandoned schools pose particular danger. Some institutions relied on symbiotic relationships with creatures to power wards or regulate magical flow. When schools collapsed, these creatures were left without guidance or containment. Over time, they adapted, becoming territorial guardians or unpredictable hazards tied to specific locations. Historians and curse breakers approach such remnants with caution. Exploration is tempting, driven by the promise of lost knowledge. Yet many expeditions end abruptly when residual magic reacts violently to intrusion. Records of these failures are often suppressed to discourage further attempts. In rare cases, remnants are repurposed. Ministries quietly stabilize sites deemed salvageable, converting them into restricted research zones or sealing them permanently. The decision to preserve or destroy is fraught, balancing potential insight against unacceptable risk. These remnants contribute to the persistent sense that wizarding history is incomplete. Students encounter spells that reference concepts never taught. Scholars debate theories with missing foundational texts. The gaps are felt even if their origins are unknown. The danger lies not only in what remains, but in what tempts rediscovery. Forgotten schools attract those who believe they can succeed where others failed, repeating cycles of ambition and collapse. As remnants fade further into obscurity, the question shifts from what was lost to why it was allowed to be forgotten. To answer that, we must examine how wizarding history chooses what to remember and what to erase. The absence of vanished wizarding schools from modern knowledge is not simply the result of time passing. It is the product of deliberate choices, institutional bias, and the fragile nature of magical record keeping. History, especially magical history, is shaped as much by what is preserved as by what is allowed to disappear. One of the most significant factors is suppression. When schools were closed for dangerous practices or political reasons, their records were often sealed or destroyed alongside them. Ministries feared that documenting such institutions in detail would invite imitation or revive prohibited disciplines. Silence was considered safer than transparency, and over generations, silence hardened into absence. Even when suppression was not intentional, neglect played a powerful role. Magical texts require maintenance. Enchanted ink fades. Living parchment deteriorates without care. Libraries abandoned during crises rarely survived intact. What little documentation escaped destruction often ended up scattered across private collections, stripped of context and attribution. Surviving institutions also shaped the narrative. Schools that endured naturally became the reference points for magical education. Their curricula defined what was considered normal, ethical, and advanced. Alternative approaches practiced by vanished schools were recast as fringe or primitive, further discouraging investigation. There is also a practical bias toward continuity. It is easier to teach history as a lineage of surviving institutions than as a mosaic of loss. Complexity is flattened. Contradictions are smoothed over. The result is a simplified narrative that prioritizes stability over truth. Memory magic further complicates matters. Obliviation, protective charms, and collective forgetting have erased knowledge on a scale unmatched in Muggle history. Entire communities have forgotten schools they once depended on. In some cases, forgetting was a kindness, sparing survivors from trauma. In others, it was a tool of control. Generational turnover accelerates erasure. Each generation asks fewer questions about what no longer exists. Without living advocates, vanished schools fade beyond recovery. Their absence becomes normal. The cumulative effect is a wizarding world that believes itself complete while standing on foundations riddled with gaps. The silence surrounding lost schools is not accidental, it is structural. With this understanding, we can finally ask what was truly lost when these institutions disappeared, not just in terms of buildings or spells, but in ways of thinking about magic itself. When wizarding schools vanished, the loss extended far beyond physical spaces or institutional names. What disappeared with them were entire ways of understanding magic, philosophies that shaped how power was approached, restrained, or integrated into daily life. Modern magical education, for all its strengths, is narrower than it once was, constrained by the absence of alternatives that no longer exist to challenge its assumptions. Many lost schools emphasized ethical frameworks that differed markedly from those taught today. Some viewed magic as a communal responsibility rather than an individual skill, insisting that power carried obligations to land, ancestry, or collective well-being. When those schools disappeared, magic increasingly became a personal pursuit, judged by legality rather than consequence. The shift was subtle, but its effects persist. Other institutions approach magic as a slow, lifelong discipline, rather than a series of techniques to be mastered in youth. Their loss contributed to a culture that prioritizes early proficiency over deep mastery. Spells are taught efficiently, but reflection is often secondary. Knowledge moves faster, but wisdom lags behind. There were also practical losses. Entire branches of spellcraft stagnated when their nurturing environments vanished. Environmental magic, large-scale healing, and long-duration enchantment suffered the most. Modern wizards encounter limitations they assume are inherent, unaware that earlier practitioners had begun to overcome them before their schools disappeared. The absence of competing philosophies also reduced resilience. When education becomes centralized, failure carries greater risk. Surviving institutions bear enormous responsibility, not because they are flawless, but because alternatives no longer exist to correct them. These losses are difficult to measure precisely because they are normalized. Wizards learn what remains and assume it is complete. Only occasionally does a spell resist explanation, or an artifact behave unpredictably, hinting at knowledge once held but never replaced. In this way, vanished schools continue to shape the present through absence. Their silence defines the boundaries of modern magic as clearly as any surviving textbook. As we come to the end of this exploration, it becomes clear that wizarding education is not guaranteed by stone walls or ancient wards. It survives only as long as knowledge is shared, questioned, and protected. Schools can vanish, traditions can fracture, memory can fade. If these stories of forgotten institutions and lost philosophies resonated with you, if you enjoy drifting through the quieter corners of wizarding history, consider liking the video and subscribing to continue exploring the lore that time nearly erased. In doing so, you help ensure that what remains is not forgotten again. As we approach the end of this story, you may find yourself dozing off to sleep or becoming dreary-eyed, or maybe you're already asleep. In either case, it is time for me to fade away and let the dreams take it from here. Have a good night and enjoy some crackles from the fireplace to help you drift further into your deep slumber.